you. Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations Local Journalist webinar. I'm Irina Faskianis, Vice President for the National Program and Outreach here at CFR. Well, CFR is an independent and nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, and publisher focused on U.S. foreign policy. CFR is also the publisher of Foreign Affairs magazine, and as always, CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policies. This webinar is part of CFR's Local Journalist Initiative, created to help you draw connections between the local issues you cover and national and international dynamics. Our programming puts you in touch with CFR resources and expertise on international issues and provides a forum on sharing best practices. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I want to remind everyone that this webinar is on the record and the video and transcript will be posted on our website after the fact at cfr.org/localjournalists. We're pleased to have Dolores Albarracin, Dana Lafon, and host Carla Ann Robbins with us to just have this discussion. Dolores Albarracin is a Penn Integrates knowledge professor and renowned scholar in the fields of attitudes, communication, and behavior. She has published close to 200 journal articles and book chapters in leading scientific outlets and has been cited over 20,000 times. She is also the author of 6 books, and her forthcoming book is titled Creating Conspiracy Beliefs: How Thoughts Are Formed. Dana Lafon is the National Intelligence Fellow here at CFR. She most recently served as chief and founder of the National Security Agency's Office of Operational Psychology, which is responsible for scaling psychologically based insights for government operations to counter some of the most egregious national security threats. And she is an expert in the fields of remote psychology assessment, influence psychology, and malign influence campaigns. And Carla Ann Robbins is a senior fellow at CFR and co-host of CFR podcast, The World Next Week. She also serves as the faculty director of the Master of International Affairs program and clinical professor of National Security Studies at Baruch College's Marks School of Public and International Affairs. And prior to that, she was deputy editorial page editor at the New York Times and chief diplomatic correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. So thank you all for being with us. I'm going to turn the conversation now over to Carla.
Irina, thank you so much. And it's great to have everybody here today. And this is quite a hot topic. And just going to have a conversation among us for about 25 minutes. And you all are journalists. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. So feel free, please throw up your hands, put questions in the chat, and we'll go from there. So, this is the year of elections. There are going to be more than 60 elections around the world. In the US, we have a highly polarized presidential election. We have races for 34 Senate seats, every House seat, 11 gubernatorial elections, 44 states with 85 legislative chambers up for grabs. So, Dana, if I may call you that, if we can start you, what do we have to watch out for in the 2024 elections around the world and in the US itself? When I think about misinformation, I'm sort of still caught in 2016, to be perfectly frank. It's the Russians doing it to us. Are the dangers in the US still mainly foreign? How much of this is homegrown? And is it different from what we saw in 2016?
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for having me. And I just want to remind everyone, I know this is on the record. I speak for myself and not any government agency or their constituent agencies. So thank you very much for hosting me and this topic. So here's the thing. The idea of misinformation or disinformation, which I'll call misinformation, is larger than the average citizen in the US, in my opinion, understands. It's a larger problem than we experienced in 2016. Nation states, such as Russia, China, Iran, and more, are actively motivated. Their motivations, if you will, to understand is to keep us distracted, to divide, driving wedges in U.S. social discord. And what this does for them, it allows certain autocratic nation states to achieve their global goals with less Western interference. So if we're occupied with other things, it's easier for those folks to achieve their goals. And this strategy goes back decades, but we are seeing an increase, particularly both from China and Russia, but it is also a domestic issue. There is a domestic threat that is on the rise. I can't give you numbers as far as percentages. I don't know how we would know, but from our observations, we can see that it's a very large increase. For example, China, they have, I'll give you a few examples. They have a state initiative that is multilingual influencers. In other words, they have multilingual influencers online that reach an audience of over 103 million people in 40 different languages. So if you think about influence strategies and influence techniques that they're perpetrating in their influence strategies, they're using things like likability because they're speaking the same language. They're able to pose as native to the country to which they're targeting. In the run-up to the 2022 elections, we saw activities such as Facebook removing the Communist China Party false personas that were targeting pro-democracy activities. They use what's called a seed and amplifier strategy. In other words, they post a seed and then they'll come back and refer to that seed for truth validation to validate their position. And that's then ignites an amplification strategy. So that's a one basic core of misinformation amplification that we see used through false personas. And from a techniques perspective, this engages techniques such as influence principles of authority, believing those in an authoritative position by perhaps using pseudo fake or fake news sites that they've sponsored, likability because of the commonality that they have with their targets, and social proof. If they can get folks to start amplifying and authentically sharing, then that amplifies the strategies. We're also seeing some things ahead of the 2024 elections. We've seen Meta remove thousands of China Facebook accounts that were false personas, posing as Americans to post on US politics and relations between Washington and Beijing. They all have their different profiles of action of how they conduct their activities that are rather distinct, but they're also getting quite savvy at it. So as we progress, it will be even harder to recognize those false strategies without strategies of our own in place to recognize. Russia has a role too. They have even more motivation to interfere in the 2024 elections than they even had, in my personal opinion, in the 2022 elections. Their goal has traditionally been at a high level to denigrate democracy through sowing that divisiveness, the confusion, the distraction, and through other means. They'll use state-owned media, they'll leverage generative AI, they'll use false personas and covert Russian intel-directed websites, and as well as cyber-enabled influence operations like we saw in 2016. They'll repeat when they hacked the DNC. We'll see more of that, in my opinion. How we combat it, I think that's something we'll discuss later in this forum, but there are ways to combat it. And so I'll pause there as the threat intel picture, and we can come back to that topic.
So Dolores, I do want to talk about, you were co-author of this APA report about how to deal with it. But can we just, is there a difference between disinformation and misinformation? Because we tend to use these words interchangeably. Are we making a mistake using them interchangeably, or can we get away with that?
I prefer an umbrella term, misinformation used more broadly. Disinformation, of course, denotes this concerted attempt at introducing known falsities with intent. Regardless, even if it's unintentional, misinformation can be equally harmful. So I don't think the distinction is necessary, although of course everything that Dana has been describing would be clear disinformation. However, its impact and spread beyond the initial influencers is equally harmful, or perhaps more, and ultimately the intended goal. Yeah.
So we shared your report, and I want to talk about with both of you about some of the recommendations. It's journalists, we've really struggled since 2016 about how to deal with misinformation and outright lies. We've been warned again and again that flagging something as untrue would only actually draw more attention to it, make it more viral, and for some people even more trusted. If you journalists write about it, I don't trust you journalists in the first place, so it's probably true if you tell us it's not true. So this APA report, using psychology to understand and fight health misinformation, has a series of recommendations that seem really relevant, not just for people covering health, but also for people covering politics. And I wanted to start with avoid repeating misinformation without including a correction. Can we talk about this? People talked about truth sandwiches, but what can you recommend to this group embarking on a year of really intense election coverage? If we know there's a lot of misinformation or disinformation on a particular topic, when do we know that it gets to a point in which we can't ignore it? Is there, some rule of thumb, say something's a lie, then talk about the lie, then remind people it's a lie? How do we deal with that?
One rule of thumb is if something is present in at least 10% of the population, that makes it a highly salient belief, and it's likely to be used in various decisions throughout the day. So in that case, I would recommend some degree of acknowledgement with all the caveats that you've mentioned. Say it's false each time you bring it up. And then have the proper correction that's detailed enough to tie fully to the initial representation of the event. So those are the general recommendations. They continue to be true. At the same time, I would say that other approaches, such as what in my research we've called bypassing, can be equally impactful. So when trying to combat misinformation, the question you want to be asking is, well, what do I want to achieve? Am I worried about the fact that if I say the election was stolen, people are going to go storm the Capitol? Well, that's one approach. Then you start there. So what would prevent storming the Capitol is a slightly different question from how do I make sure they know the election was not stolen? And there are different pathways. One being that, well, first of all, if you maybe address the misinformation, but especially reinforce any belief and attitude that would protect the Capitol, that's our most urgent goal, in my opinion. It's not the misinformation in and of itself. It's the actual consequences. So with that in mind, I think in addition to corrections, even more important sometimes is simply talking about everything that's going to essentially lead to your goal and making sure that information is properly received. So, for instance, if you're trying to get people to support GMOs, how are you going to get there? You can say, well, one problem is people think they bring cancer. I can go ahead and correct that. But at the same time, you can emphasize and introduce new ideas that people don't have in mind. And that is actually a lot more effective than trying to simply correct the misinformation. But that begins with knowing that you want to change the ultimate attitude towards GMOs. You don't necessarily care about simply the belief in the cancer effects, if that makes sense.
Of course, it wouldn't be the role of a newspaper to get people to, support GMOs. But it would be, I say this as a former deputy editorial page editor, which is different from being a reporter, but having been both. But on both sides, it certainly is the role of newspapers to support free speech and democracy and the truth. We certainly struggled, even on the editorial page when I was at the Times, with saying somebody was lying. We didn't used to use the word lie because lie implied intent. I think the first time we even used the word lie on the edit page at the Times was we finally got around to say that Dick Cheney was lying. The lie had been said so many times that we finally decided we could do it. And when the Times finally used the word lie with Trump on the front page, it made news. People were writing stories about the fact that the Times had said on the front page that Trump had lied. And part of it was, the gray lady had finally done it, but part of it was this question of, were we drawing too much attention? Were we undercutting the credibility? But I think there is this other thing. Is there a certain percentage of the population that you're just not going to reach? And what percentage of the population is up for grabs even for this conversation? I mean, I suppose that's really, Dana, to go back to you about, can you change people's minds with good coverage?
Yeah, I think it's important to that final point you made, Carla, that you have to know your audience. Who are you reaching? It's intuitive to believe that truth will counter misinformation. And that's psychologically not so, that there are certain cognitive biases and influence strategies that are going on that make the opposite actually true, right? So if you commit to one belief, you will behave consistently to demonstrate your belief. And when you're faced with, someone telling you, no, you're wrong, you will traditionally, human beings, right, will traditionally dig their feet in and look for evidence that supports their belief, and naturally not even observe evidence that dissuades their belief. That's confirmation bias. It's a very normal human response. Facts don't move people, stories move people. And I think that is one of the core essence of a good misinformation campaign. It's that narrative that speaks to an emotive knee-jerk response. The goal of a misinformation campaign is to get people to do something that's in the narrator's favor. So simply changing a belief is not the end goal of a misinformation campaign. The end goal is to provide an action, whether it's we're distracted, whether we increase our social discourse, whatever that action, that's the goal of the misinformation campaign. So journalists, I think, are in a really interesting yet very difficult position, because countering it with truth is not savvy enough to counter the effects of the misinformation campaign. In my opinion, I think it would be useful to use some of those strategies. For example, pre-bunking, right? Getting the information out before it's used in a misinformation campaign. Perhaps calling out the alternative or the critic side to your piece to say, my critics may say this, which describes the potential narrative of a misinformation campaign. And then you address it from, demonstrating the actual motivations of who is providing this information. So that's one example. We saw that when, in the beginning of the Ukraine invasion, the US government declassified some information that we understood Mr. Putin was going to use as fodder for misinformation campaigns. And if you notice, those information campaigns were really, really thwarted, because there's a phenomenon that who says it's first, it's true. So getting that information out there first gives a sort of credibility to that information. There's also repeatability. Say repeatability is believability. So expressing the journalist's article, their writing in this way, repeated through various forums, repeated through various mediums and different sources, is a way to build that credibility and the veracity of their article. Highlighting the motivations of the source and letting the reader, you're taking the reader on the story of this is why it would be in the best interest of the narrator. Here's what they're trying to accomplish. It appears that this is what they're trying to accomplish. Now, I'm not saying don't use facts, of course, but if you can marry it into your own narrative, into a story that is fact-based, I think you have a much more robust possibility to counter the effects. The tricky thing is, once that misinformation campaign or disinformation campaign is out there, you can't put that cat back in the bag, as they say. It's out there. It's going to have an effect because it's implicit. It works on implicit levels, unconsciously, but you can shape a response to build that immunity for future influence campaigns.
Dolores, Dana went through quite a few things that were on your list. I wanted to have your reaction to those things, this notion of journalists playing a role in pre-bunking, journalists playing a role establishing their credibility by taking us behind the curtain, saying, explaining the motivations of sources, establishing more credibility that way. Can you talk about those things?
Yes, I think the impact on actions brings us back to what is the ultimate goal here. And pre-bunking can be effective and corrections can be effective, but in the end, they will come up with a new false piece to bring to the table. So in that sense, anything that's tied to the content, that you have to go out and pre-bunk has a limited effect because they have ample time to come up with new facts that then you need to go out and pre-bunk, and you cannot even fully anticipate them. So I would say that a more general approach of fortifying the knowledge base of our citizens is key, so that they have enough structures in their minds to be on the alert and be able to recognize it themselves, not have to be told each thing that's false. So that general structure is important. And secondly, of course, is protecting the integrity of our institutions, which you know how to do probably better than any other player in society. So what do we do about attacks on science? What do we do on attacks on academia? All the respected sources kind of falling apart. This seems to me like the real problem, more than having to pre-bunk each potential misinformation piece that's going to be produced. So if you protect some of the sources and they remain critical reference in society, that is going to be a lot more impactful than operating on the level of each misinformation piece as a strategy and as a nation. What else can I tell you? The other is, of course, denouncing the actions. Yes, we care about misinformation. It can be harmful, but still there is a very long way between misinformation and behavior. And for the most part, the impact is very, very small. And this is something that we show in the report. It's not like, oh, you hear a piece of misinformation and you move from there to walking into the White House with some assassination attempt. So this is something important to keep in mind. What is really a source of concern, in my view, and based on a lot of research, is not just the misinformation, but what do we do when influencers online introduce new processes by which we should take down, the university leaders. It's the actions. It's not the misinformation. Is that this has happened, and now I'm going to move to do X and create, opportunities for a congressional hearing on X issue. So to me, a very good catalog and denouncing of the actions of these actors. That's where I would go, because that is very close to behavior and perhaps more or less, focused on that aspect. I don't know if that
Although the decline of trust in institutions is across the board in institutions in this country. Congress is lower than than universities, but if you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer and other, the Gallup does this, year after year, and you see the decline of trust. Trust in the quote mainstream media is, it's we're not going to be going around propping up trust in the president of Penn or the president of Harvard, and because people don't trust us in the first place. I think we certainly have to think about why people don't trust us and how, and how we can, one of your recommendations is to leverage trusted sources to counter misinformation and provide accurate information. You say health information. I think how much we interact with the community around, I think we have to figure out who people do trust when we tell our stories, because we can't rely as we did, 50 years ago and just say people just trust us because we are the press. So is there a way of building up trust in our institutions so at least people can listen to what we believe we're purveying, which is as close to the truth as we can get it? Dana?
Sure. I think what we're talking about there is building credibility, right? And that's a different animal than influence inoculation. There's different ways to build, and I know that's not the topic of our discussion, but there are different ways to build credibility. And I think having that reputation is key, right? Reputation is lost, particularly in crisis. Reputation is made or lost. And I think that having that long-term reputation and also that repeatability of the same messaging, that your stories are providing from a journalistic standpoint is valuable. But if you're talking about how do we build institutional credibility, I think that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother journalism seminar. But there are certainly psychological ways to build that credibility.
So I wanted to ask both of you a question, which is, have we seen countries that have done a better job of getting through a barrage of misinformation, of outside attempt or inside attempts to get people to throw up their hands and say, well, I just don't trust anybody, so I'm just not going to trust reality? Certainly we saw that in Ukraine, and that started from 2014 on, long predated what we went through. And you see this even today. I was just preparing for something for our podcast, and I was looking at this something in the pro-Russian press saying there were threats against the Hungarian foreign minister who's going to have a meeting in Ukraine, and he possibly couldn't to set foot in Ukraine. I mean, they're fabulous at disinformation. I mean, there's the EU has something called the EU Disinformation Review, and every week you see this sort of these viral stories they're pushing out there. But people in Ukraine have just gotten, I think they've just gotten to the point in which they just have shrugged this off there because they've had a decade of it. Taiwan seems to have done a very good job of getting through their election, of not taking it particularly seriously because they were warned about it, whatever. I mean, are there countries that have figured out how to deal with this better than we have? Have you seen, sort of strategies that to prepare going into an election season, either of you?
I'll let Dana answer this question. I mean, I know that there is variability in specific forms of trust. So, for instance, Argentina is highest in trust in science, but I don't know that there is one particular country that has managed to fight misinformation as a whole.
I think if we look to countries, particularly the near abroad for Russia, those countries, they've been dealing with this challenge for a long time, and they've had some success in managing, living in the solution space, and how do we counter those offenses toward their country. We've seen it in Georgia. We've seen it around, countries that are bordering Russia. We've seen them do it through entertainment. There are countries in, I want to say Georgia, but it might be one of the different countries, forgive me, that uses a television show to address disinformation campaigns and to provide in an entertaining way the alternative narrative that and the narrator and what they're proposing. Very interesting. One country, I believe this was Georgia, used the artists, right? So they would give the narrative to the artists, and artists would reinterpret it through their art and then communicate that to the populace. And that was extremely, extremely useful in countering the narratives that came from these disinformation campaigns. And it also continually acts to inoculate the people viewing those programs so that they're continually getting a booster on inoculating their ability to build healthy skepticism, to slow down their thinking, to be more critical thinking. So all of those attempts that we've seen in those near abroad countries to Russia have had some success. Now, we can't simply translate those actions, those activities that have been successful into different cultures without some thought, without some appreciation for how they would be translated into different cultures and different countries. But I think there's a body of work there that to look in the solution space to those countries and take a note.
So we do have a question already, but I just wanted to very quickly ask Dolores, if I wanted to write a story about, programs that people are trying to prepare people to better train people to resist misinformation, are there any cool programs out there that I could go and write about? I mean, I know it's in early stages, and I know that right after January 6th, the military was looking into this about how to prepare people who were new recruits so that they weren't radicalized. I mean, are there effective programs out there, or at least ones that are in early stages that are worth looking at for training, whether they're for young kids or they're for young adults? Or
there are some media literacy types of training. I would argue that the K-12 system should be the system that does that, because it's not a matter of, okay, you give me 2 lessons on how to identify misinformation. It's going to change next month in response to what we teach them. So it's a critical thinking skills, the fact that scientific decisions or health decisions are well informed by science, and you don't politicize science because it's almost sinful. It's really building the values that are going to protect society from manipulating these institutional actors. I think that's the only long-term solution I can imagine. It's not going to be a quick fix. By the time people have no understanding of science, or cannot even think about the word evolution without thinking it's potentially problematic religiously and all. I mean, I don't really know that we can change specific pieces without a massive overhaul of how we instruct kids on all of these issues, and create spaces in which there are certain institutions that are trustworthy and others that shouldn't be involved in certain spheres.
Can I ask a research question for either of you, which is, so if I wanted to, both of you talked about how important it is to sort of get ahead of a story, because it's very hard to get the cat back in the bag. So how do I do that? I mean, certainly, I'm not going to date myself from how long I've been out of the daily business. But we had people at the Times whose job it was to monitor Twitter to see whether there was news that was breaking out on Twitter before it broke out on the wires. But how do we know when you said, Dolores, you said when 10% of the population starts believing something, how do we know that? How do we know when something is pre-viral but threatening to become viral, so that we can get out ahead of a misinformation or disinformation story?
I mean, in our world, we would know through surveys or some sort of check. I think journalists are pretty well tuned to whatever is in the mix that could be potentially growing, yes, and that could be leveraged to explain new things, and especially in a false way. I don't know any other way than following your gut on what might become problematic and putting it out there as early as possible.
So, Dana, you come from the intelligence community. How do you guys, know when something's coming down that hasn't, totally blasted into mainstream consciousness?
Yeah, and we may not always know as well, right? So that I don't think it's reasonable to ask the journalist to get in front of that narrative. It's impossible. I think our challenge as to you as a journalist is, once it's there, how do you report it in a way that begins that inoculation process by explaining, as Dolores spoke to, linking it to that misinformation and explaining why, not just that it's misinformation, but explaining why, and then explaining what is the technique that was used, the influence technique that was used. And that is basically the influence inoculation process, right? You're aware that it happens, you understand the link, and then you refute it through identifying the technique and then explaining how you could refute that, how you could counter that. If you could shape the writing to integrate those steps of the inoculation process, that is one way. But I don't think it's a one, you're not going to do it as a society with one aspect. To Dolores's point, education is key, and I absolutely agree. K through 12 should increase critical thinking skills, particularly when looking for ways that we're influenced. And you can use different strategies. You can use marketing strategies or are full of influence campaigns for good or for bad, but you still being able to recognize them helps inoculate them. And then I would put out a challenge. Here at the council, we talk a lot about AI. And so I would challenge AI to help us identify what are the strategies to get in front of these information campaigns or misinformation campaigns that are going to be at our doorstep. So it's education, building that immunity, building that critical thinking and healthy skepticism. It's, as journalists, hopefully being able to report it in a way that increases that inoculation and connects the story that you're writing to the misinformation and explaining why, and then looking to our technological advances to help us with this problem.
So both AI for good and evil, and I do want to get
There you
into.
go.
We have a question from Robert Cheney from the Missoulian. Robert, do you want to ask your question? I can read it, but I'd much rather have him read it or speak it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Please.
Hi there. We're in a situation in Montana where the state Republican Party is about to start a big campaign promoting mail ballot use for the 2024 elections. But there is a faction of our state GOP party that is an extremely John Birch Society election denier crew. And they are bound and determined to counter their own colleagues with a lot of mail ballot is insecure, mail ballot is a fraud, election offices are untrustworthy. And unfortunately, an awful lot of them consider most of the traditional media in the state as also untrustworthy. So they're not real receptive to us covering their own campaigns for mail ballots. So we're kind of looking at this as do we just cover their internal battle over who's going to be right about mail ballot security, or do we try to somehow, I'm just looking for strategies for how to cover this, because we're going to see a whole bunch of anti-mail ballot election fraud stuff floating around in the waves in large part by a party that doesn't want to have it.
I'm happy to let Dolores speak it, or I can speak to it.
Is it possible to not cover it? If that's an option, I mean, de-emphasizing it and minimizing would be probably the best solution in this case, rather than giving them a megaphone to further disseminate their false claims. Is that an option?
More than 10% of the population believes it. I mean, by your own standard.
Well, no. That was, how do we know if this is potentially impactful? But it may be 10% of the population, but it's not impactful. So, for instance, if people believe the Earth is flat, it has no consequences for us. So that's the other part.
But Robert, is this impactful? It sounds like this is potentially impactful, isn't it?
We've had a couple of county election offices, one in political races by election deniers who have then caused all kinds of mayhem for school board and local mayor elections because they don't know how to run the system. They hate it so much. So we've got active internal disputes within the GOP party here who are vying for power and influence at the statewide level. And part of this group is actively pushing that the mail ballot system is illegitimate. So I don't think we can not cover it,
Okay.
but we're going to have a lot of difficulty getting what you might call the majority portion of the GOP party to look at us with any more credibility than they look at their own internal adversaries.
And it's how large proportionally is this group, the deniers?
I would give them between 15 and 30%.
So, I mean, anything emphasizing that it's a minority and probably putting them in a different context with experts from other states so that you kind of change the weight of the 15% as evidence for the credibility of the claim, that might be a way of doing it. Sort of going outside Montana, see what this really says about election processes more broadly, perhaps.
And I might add that this is a very big local challenge for you. And I want to be sensitive to the journalism integrity as you are, that, you report what's happening, but at the same time, if you know the potential narratives that come through the disinformation of saying mail-in ballots are not effective, saying mail-in ballots are not going or lead to false election results, you can put all of that in your stories ahead of time when you're covering, mail-in ballots. And when you're covering mail-in ballots, you can cover, the critics say this might not work, or here's some information about, the veracity of mail-in ballots and their effectiveness prior to their campaign, if possible. I don't know the timing that you're dealing with, but I would recommend that, getting ahead of it and then repeating it is a potential option. But I think it's a local problem that's not avoidable.
Particularly because it's also a national story. I mean, there's this gap between the GOP in lots of states, and meanwhile, there are a lot of states in which the RNC is pushing for people to vote early or to vote mail-in, and then you have former President Trump who's on the campaign trail saying, "Don't vote early. This stuff the integrity of this is just total." So this is going to go on between now and the election. So it's a story. I don't think you can avoid it. But I think it's, this is going to be a true sandwich story also, which is every time you write about it, you're going to have to say, there is no proof that mail-in ballots are insecure. So we've Gabrielle Gurley from the American Prospect. Gabrielle, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I'll read it. Let me just find where I am. And is there any evidence that hostile state actors are working with domestic groups to create or facilitate misinformation campaigns?
And
you want me to-
some New Hampshire. Can you describe the New Hampshire incident that you referenced?
Oh, the New Hampshire robocall incident is the robocall using it's a voice cloning apparently. Where President Biden's voice was used telling people not to vote in the primary and wait till November to vote. That went out from a former New Hampshire Democratic official's phone number, apparently.
But you're not suggesting that was from a hostile state actor?
No, I'm not. I was just asking.
Oh, these are separate questions. Got it.
These
Okay.
are two separate questions. Yes.
So
So-
Dana,
Yeah.
hostile state actors working with domestic groups to facilitate misinformation campaigns.
Yeah, I've not personally seen any evidence of that. I would also suggest that there certainly could be a false flag, which means that it could be Iran posing as someone within the US or someone within the US posing as Russia. So there are false flag operations that go on, and that is quite common. So I don't see any, I personally don't see any evidence. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist or the evidence isn't out there. I haven't seen it in my work, in my readings, but there are false flag operations.
Mhm.
Can I follow up with the question, which is that before the 2020 elections, and before the midterm elections, there was a pretty big effort by Homeland Security to work with states to avoid hacking and a variety of other things. So people seem to be quite vigilant about it. And nothing bad happened that we're aware of. Have they let down their guard, or is there continued vigilance going into this election that you're aware of, Dana?
From what I see, it's CISA, the organization working with states, and I also see FBI domestically working with states to shore up those secure environments. So I think that there is a lot of domestic efforts to ensure the security of the elections, particularly around the technology around it. I can't speak to any particular action, but I think that's under the guise of CISA at this point.
So there's probably quite good stories for people to be looking at what CISA is doing in individual states, because you're already hearing, people going to be raising questions about the integrity of the vote and voting machine and ballots. And there will only be paper ballots, going forward. There will never be another electronic voting machine and all of that. So I think that will probably be a story closer to the election. But I'd be really interested to see what CISA is doing, particularly after, remember, Krebs quit, and there were just all of these things that happened in the end of the Trump administration. I don't think people have been covering CISA very much, but I think there's probably some really good state stories about state funding and CISA and what people have done to strengthen the integrity of their, particularly the election. There's going to be a lot of, because I've heard the Trump campaign talking a lot about electronic voting machines and how unreliable they are. And if they don't have paper trails, I think there's interesting questions there as well.
I would love to see that too. I would love to see the journalists on this call dig into, what is DHS doing? What are they doing at a state level? I don't know personally those stories, so I would love to see that.
Christina Shockley, who is with Public Radio, from local host of All Things Considered at WUOM in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Christina, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah. So I'm no longer at Michigan Radio, which is now Michigan Public, but I am still heavily working with stations across the country. And because of the relationship that we tend to like to have with our listeners, and because of how we are funded, which is primarily through listener contributions, I'm wondering if you think that there are any specific, unique ways that public media can go about fighting disinformation and misinformation. Thank you.
I would love to see public media advertise the inoculation process and make that a common nomenclature amongst your audience so that they are understanding and getting boosters and actually exercising that building of the immunity to influence attacks. I think there's two ways we can stop disinformation. We can stop the actors doing it, or we can harden us or cognitively to be more prepared to thwart it. So I would love to see that.
Dolores, can I ask you about the role of the social media companies? Among your recommendations is demand data access and transparency from social media companies for scientific research on misinformation. I mean, I've seen reporting that says that that Meta has laid off all sorts of people who were supposed to be hardening themselves against misinformation and run up to elections. And Are they taking this seriously? And are they willing to be transparent? Can you talk about the relationship between researchers and what you're seeing about their preparation for elections?
Yes, it's been a problem to ensure access to the data, especially, of course, Twitter, which was completely cut off and became incredibly expensive. So our ability to get a glimpse even has diminished, if not gone away completely. So I mean, that's what I can say about the researcher side of things. The companies are obviously not motivated by the goal of ensuring national security or anything like that. It's all a financial gain that they seek. So whatever efforts they have tend to be very short lasting and often too late. And then they are gone, and until we're up to here of misinformation, they typically don't activate new methods. But I think Twitter has been perhaps the most problematic in terms of ensuring any sort of filter.
And does Meta share information? Because Dana in the beginning cited some numbers from Meta. I was just wondering whether does Meta share data with you?
No, they don't. They've done the occasional project in which they will share results of what they analyzed internally, but they normally don't share anything broadly. Yeah. And Twitter used to be the most accessible, but still had a lot of limitations. You never knew what the sample really looked like, and it's all fairly restricted. Yeah, so that's unfortunate. I don't know what Dana has to say about this.
I know from what I've read in open source in reporting that Meta's, I think there was a recorded futures article I reference in my paper for Renewing America for CFR about how Meta had reportedly reduced or taken down a significant amount of false persona accounts attempting to pretend to be US citizens. So what I know, I learned from the folks in this call in the journalist environment, but there is some reporting of different companies. There's also a wonderful Microsoft report on on misinformation and disinformation campaigns from China, Russia, and North Korea that I would strongly recommend if folks who are interested in getting some understanding of activities and how they're approaching social media and what a little bit about what social media is doing. I would send your audience to that.
We can share links to all of that with everybody. We'll push that out after this. Can we talk a little bit about AI while I'm way up? Do we have another? We have another question. Yay. Okay. Jordan Call. Can you would you like to voice your question and tell us who you work with? I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the list right now.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so thank you so much. Jordan Cole here. So recently I'm a freelance reporter and I just finished my graduate program at Columbia Graduate Journalism School. So I just finished there. My question is in two parts. One, we know that there seems to be especially with Twitter, journalists are consumed by the platform. I think a lot of the messaging, a lot of political journalists that cover politics are in an X because there seems to be a lot of, you have your senators, you have politicians that represent these platforms. So my first question is how, and especially given the fact that like CEOs like Elon Musk, tech company hosts, are re-platforming figures that were clearly giving like disinformation ads, like we have Alex Jones, for instance, with the whole defamation case of Sandy Hook, and then Trump as well spreading these. So how do we resolve this issue? And where, in terms of ad space, subscribers, are being like advertisers are pulling out of X significantly because of what CEOs are the decision-making process that they've placed. Not sure if I've clarified the question, but one of them would be, how do we resolve those actions taken by higher execs to permit to give them open access to these people to rejoin these accounts again when they clearly have violated the guidelines and the misinformation guidelines, et cetera.
Do you mean from a public policy point of view? Do you mean you think government should be doing something, or do you mean that we as journalists should be boycotting?
I think it would be like more so the journalist part of it, because what are we? Our job is not to, we simply, again, we don't write the policies that they've put for themselves. So how do we become more, I guess, alert in how to navigate through that?
Do we do the Dolores sort of just ignore them? That's sort of. I mean, I must admit that I'm so profoundly ambivalent to the point of when we still, the council still do, things on X. We do X Spaces, what used to be Twitter Spaces, and that was an editorial board language. So, I don't know. Do you guys think that everybody should just boycott Twitter and get it over with?
We all think that, but institutionally, people don't find a way of getting out because they have their following, and nothing has emerged that's equally successful, or popular. So nobody can leave, because how do they get their information out of the credible institutions that still have X accounts?
And one point is, and I think Dolores spoke about this earlier, is that where do you get your news source from? People should not be getting their news sources from social media. I shouldn't say should. I encourage people not to get their news sources from social media. It's a way to absorb information, and that's great, but this is a very difficult challenge, right? This has been a challenge for many years. There's no easy button here, Jordan. I can't speak to how journalists could counter, these effects, but I think looking at it as a social media platform versus a news platform is something that you could educate your audience on. And congrats for finishing your grad school.
Yeah, let's hope you haven't gathered.
Although Twitter used to be an excellent source for all kinds of news. So why couldn't we have a platform like that that's maintained by the main media sources and use it for that purpose, a more centralized
like
system.
A news source that is that media.
Yeah,
news media. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Well, we are going to have if President Trump is reelected, we are going to have a real challenge, which is how much do we quote, things that sound like social media posts every time they come out of his mouth, as it is right now, people are being very careful about how much they quote the things he says on Truth Social. But once they're utterances from the Oval Office, these are major journalistic challenges. How much are you repeating things that are frightening versus just sort of draws that are frightening? So these are major challenges to come. Well, I just want to thank you both for a really, I wish it were a happier conversation, but a really interesting conversation. Thank you everybody for raising questions. It's always good when we end with more questions. And Emily Bell is wonderful to talk about this from Jordan. So, Jordan, I hope you haven't graduated too much debt and that you get hired soon. So I'm going to turn it back to Irina. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. As Carlos said, we appreciate it. And we will be sending out the link to the transcript and the video after this, as well as links to the resources that were mentioned. You can follow us our work on CFR.org, foreignaffairs.com, and thinkglobalhealth.org for the latest developments and analysis on international trends and how they're affecting the United States. And do email us your suggestions for future webinars. You can email localjournalists@cfr.org. So again, thank you all for being with us today.